development of muscle, and the development of connective tissue. So we will be dealing with the development of tongue under these three headings. First one, moving on to the mucous membrane. As we all know, there are anterior 2/3 and posterior 1/3 for a tongue. So if this is a diagrammatic representation of our tongue, this is the anterior 2/3, and this is the posterior 1/3. This anterior and posterior portion is divided by a V-shaped boundary, and this V-shaped boundary is known as sulcus terminalis. Under sulcus terminalis, at the apex of the sulcus terminalis, we could see the foramen cecum. We have seen that foramen cecum lies under the tuberculum impar as a tiny opening. We have seen it in the previous section while we are discussing about the pharyngeal arches. Now, and we have got anterior 2/3 and posterior 1/3. Now, development of this anterior 2/3 begins with the growth of the tuberculum impar. As the tuberculum impar grows, and by the 5th week, this lingual swellings, there are two lingual swellings, and these two lingual swellings, they would grow, enlarge, and they would merge with each other. These two lingual swellings would enlarge and merge with each other, and they would also merge with this tuberculum impar, and they would also enlarge. These two lingual swellings would enlarge and they merge with each other, and they would also merge with this tuberculum impar, and this merging would result in the formation of a large mass. They form a large mass. This large mass finally develops into the anterior 2/3 portion of our tongue. So the anterior 2/3 is formed from the first pharyngeal arch, because the first pharyngeal arch is the one that gives rise to the lingual swelling and tuberculum impar, and finally these two swellings enlarge and they merge with each other and give rise to the mucous membrane of the anterior 2/3. Now we have got posterior 1/3. We have seen here that the mesoderm of the second, third and fourth arches, they grows and form the hypobrachial eminence, and the posterior 1/3 portion of the tongue is formed from these hypobrachial eminence formed from the second, third and the fourth arch. So the hypobrachial eminence is the one responsible for the growth of the posterior 1/3 portion of our tongue. So when we see the pharyngeal arches in this view, these are the 4 pharyngeal arches. By this time, the first pharyngeal arch get converted into the anterior 2/3 region. So this is the anterior 2/3, and later on this third pharyngeal arch, they grows overgrowth. That means they overgrowth over the second pharyngeal arch. They grow as if they are engulfing the second pharyngeal arch. They overgrow over the second pharyngeal arch, and the second pharyngeal arch get embedded below the third pharyngeal arch. So the diagram would appear as if like this. So this shaded portion is the third pharyngeal arch. So when we are looking from the surface, we could see that the first pharyngeal arch has formed the anterior 1/3 of our tongue, and the posterior anterior 2/3 of our tongue, and the posterior 1/3 is contributed by this third pharyngeal arch, because second pharyngeal arch cannot take place in that formation because it has been embedded under the third pharyngeal arch. So the posterior 1/3 is formed from the third pharyngeal arch, from the hypobrachial eminence. So this is how the anterior 2/3 and posterior 1/3 portion of our tongue is formed. Now moving to the posterior most region of our tongue. Posterior most region. Here, the posterior most region is formed from the fourth pharyngeal arch. We have seen that the hypobrachial eminence formed from the second, third and fourth pharyngeal has got cranial part as well as the caudal part. This cranial part has been taken place in the formation of the development of posterior one-third, because second and third one are the one that contributes to the cranial part of hypobrachial eminence. They have already taken they have already helped for the formation of posterior one-third. Now what is remaining is the caudal part formed from the fourth pharyngeal arch. This caudal part helps in the formation of epiglottis. Epiglottis. As we all know, epiglottis is a leaf-shaped flap in the throat that prevents food from entering into the food pipe and into the windpipe and into the lungs. So, the caudal part of the hypobrachial eminence further develops into the epiglottis. Now, we have completed the development of mucous membrane. Now, we have got to discuss the muscles and the connective tissue. Moving on to the muscle. Now, the muscles are derived from the myoblast. Muscles are derived from the myoblast, which originates in the occipital somates. Consider this as the portion of the head, and these are the precervical somate. Precervical somate. Each somate has myotome, dermatome and sclerotome. Each somate has all these: myotome, dermatome and sclerotome. Myotome, dermatome and sclerotome. So, the muscle is developed from the myoblast, which originates in the occipital somates. Consider this as the head region. These are the precervical somate. Each somate has a myotome, dermatome and a sclerotome. So, the myotomes from the occipital region, they would migrate forward into the tongue area. That is, they are now situated in the occipital region, and from there they migrate towards the future tongue area. So, while traveling, they would carry their nerve innervation along with them. That is the hypoglossal nerve. That explains the nerve innervation of the muscles of our tongue. We would see the nerve innervation detail in our next video. So, the muscles of the tongue are originating from the occipital myotomes. They travel or migrate from there into the future tongue area, and they would also carry their nerve innervation along with them. That is the hypoglossal nerve. Now, moving on to the connective tissue. The connective tissues are derived from the local mesenchyme. The connective tissues of our tongue are derived from the local mesenchyme. So, this is what we have to write when the development of tongue is asked for our exams. So, we have to begin with this diagram. This is an important diagram. It should be labeled, and all the swellings and the parts has to be marked, which could fetch you more marks. And while we are writing points, we can write it under 3 headings: development of mucous membrane, development of muscles and development of connective tissue. Then the mucous membrane should be explained under 3 headings: anterior 2/3, posterior 1/3 and the posterior most region. You have to say the anterior 2/3 is formed from the first pharyngeal arch, while the posterior 1/3 is formed from the hypobrachial eminence because of the overgrowth of the third pharyngeal arch. This diagram has to be included in the posterior 1/3 region, and the posterior most region is from the fourth pharyngeal arch. Then you have to tell about the muscle. It is developed from the occipital myotomes. Occipital myotomes. And they would migrate from there to the future tongue area, and they would also carry the nerve innervation along with them. And finally, the connective tissue, it is derived from the local mesenchyme. That marks the end of the development of tongue. Thank you for watching.